Hello and welcome to my delayed feedback on your Google Hangout 5, which was touching on the aspects of virtual EOCs, virtual communications, and the use of technology in emergency management. And I wanted to thank you for a good discussion among the three of you. And I'm going to touch up on some key issues that you discussed in your session. So first and foremost, you talked about the real-time hooking into the virtual networks and using private security and private contracts to leverage the city or county or public institutions, as far as access to information and information sharing. And I think that Matthew commented on that fact that he wasn't aware that, or didn't think about the big importance of leveraging those existing networks and systems that are already in place in certain jurisdictions for as it related to the article that you read. Ryan mentioned the importance of the IT partners. I believe that during your internship in Dallas County, you had somebody from EDS and used the IT partner that knew that how they the city worked, and being able to build off the systems that were already in place and leveraging those. So it coincided with our discussion topics. I think you had a lot of discussion on the pros and the cons of being able to connect virtually, particularly with the aspect of the incident command and managing events as they occurred. And you had an interesting discussion with pros and cons using the web portals to exchange the actual information. And you talked about the accessibility, the fact that, when the incidents do occur, the people that are responsible for making certain decisions might not all already be there or not be there in the initial moments of the incident. So having access, and leveraging technology for that is definitely a plus if you want people that would typically at the institution or agency be involved in the decision making, to have the ability to do so. And I actually had that experience when for Texas Division of Emergency Management conference a few years back during the floods. And from Transtar, which you actually discussed, the role of Transtar, and I'm going to touch upon that later. But most of the critical crew from Transtar, particularly from the Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, were at the conference where when the floods were happening. So, they were able to use their systems, remotely, and start by delegating some of the tasks and, activating and doing those critical decisions remotely. Of course, the Harris County is fourth largest in the country. So their technology is very robust and very developed. When we're talking about smaller jurisdictions, they might not have access to those platforms yet, or not. They're not as expansive. So definitely the virtual solutions are good in situations like that when you need to particularly, if the flights are canceled, if the event for some reason disrupts the transportation and you cannot get somewhere, those are really useful. And another example I had for you during I was in South Montgomery County Office of Emergency Management, and we had somebody from Catastrophic Medical Operations Center. The Catastrophic Medical Operations Center in Houston, or CMOC, is an entity, is a medical emergency response entity that gets activated during a big health disaster. And it connects all the corridors of different networks of hospitals and clinics and healthcare providers and public health. And they have their representatives in CMOC. Well, during Ike, one of the persons that was responsible for being in the CMOC, she couldn't get there because the roads were impassable to Houston after the landfall. And so she was able to sit in our EOC and access the web EOC, which is a state designated platform for managing crises in the state of Texas. So out of Austin, out of the state operating center in Austin, they are using web EOC. And what the web EOC is, it's if you haven't seen it or haven't heard about it, I encourage you to research it a little bit, because it is becoming a sort of really useful tool for many jurisdictions in many states. It used to be a very expensive proprietary software, but now more and more cities and large jurisdictions have bought into it. So those licenses have become cheaper. But what WebEOC is a bunch of different situational boards, and they are activated on need-to-know basis. So, and they will have different layers of information. So, for example, for a hospital system, the hospitals in Harris County would have information that is live, such as availability of beds in the emergency department, the status of the evacuation of the hospital, if the hospital is evacuating, where they are evacuating to, you know, how they are moving the personnel. And so that would be available through CMOG for most of the medical and healthcare operations. So if you're a healthcare provider or a hospital, or if you are part of an incident command team at a certain jurisdiction with a need to know this information, you would have access to WebEOC that deals just with that layer or with that situational update board, and you would have access to it, and you would monitor it, and you can input into it as well. So the person from Catastrophic Medical Operations Center that was in Montgomery County, she was actually able to access WebEOC because Montgomery County South was using it as well. So those situational boards were she could access them. And the WebEOC could be also very useful at the regional and state level, to where you can access information what's happening at the state, what's happening in the regions, what staging areas are being activated. At that point, for us, there was a staging area in Lufkin that was being opened, and so it was updating what they had, what kind of resources, how they're going to be deploying those resources. So if you needed to stage smaller staging areas or needed resources in your area, you could track how they were being dispatched and what they had and what you could expect. So it's good live monitoring of those updates. And the other thing, the people that had access to it, some of the vendors had access to it, so they could post messages such as, this particular vendor had 5,000 gallons of diesel, and somebody from a different jurisdiction was looking for, how to support their generators in a hospital. Because they needed to, of course, to maintain their operations, the continuity of operations. So WebEOC is one of those examples, and the person that was in a different location was still able to coordinate with CMOC just because she used that platform. So there are those type of benefits to having technology at your disposal, and more decentralized way of everybody being so mobile and possibly in different locations when those unprecedented or unanticipated events happen, but they have that general situational awareness of what's happening, the common operating picture. But you also discussed, concurrently with that, you talked about how actually being in the EOC And making decisions face to face also has benefits, because you sit with the people that are making those life decisions, and those decisions are made faster when they are made face to face. And also the fact that organizations and agencies are resistant to change. So even though you are introducing the technology, the common saying is, if you really want to have good decision making, you get a box of donuts and bring people together, and you have interoperability in the room. And of course, that's ideal to have more centralized location where everybody convenes, the actual physical EOC that you pre-equipped, that you have an equipment that you're familiar with, you have an environment you're familiar with, that you've trained with in that particular location, you know everybody there, that increases the security of access, credentialing, and you don't have to worry about any cyber intrusion. When you're dealing with those virtual issues, you have to have passcodes, and those need to know and determine the levels of clearance, who has access to what. Whereas when you're dealing with the event face to face, that definitely has benefits as well. And so pros and cons, definitely, ideally you want to have everybody in the same room, but there's going to be a time when you can leverage those technological solutions to help you in the incident, particularly if it's geographically spread or, there is no access to it. And of course, as with everything, the use of technology is only as good as the people that are practicing with using it. Because I'll give you that example of the web EOC. We had it in Montgomery County, but it was purchased, it was installed, and a couple people got training on it. And then, of course, those people, as Murphy would want to have it, those people were not in the EOC during Ike. So the people that were trained were actually not there. And even though we had access, only, a few people knew how to use it. So, and then the people were not using it to its optimum. They were mostly using it as a scrolling situational update board, but they were not really inputting data in there because, very few people knew how it worked. So except for the person that I just mentioned that used it because she was very well trained by her CMOC entity for their purposes how to use it. So with the technology comes constant updates and making sure that the software is working, that any updates are being implemented, so you're not getting into the system and you realize the password expired, or of course in a time of emergency it's not a good time to be looking for somebody to give you a new password. The other great use of the virtual entity, and I think Ryan discussed that, or maybe Matthew, maybe both. You talked about elected officials, and elected officials don't necessarily, or it is a tremendous burden on emergency response when you have political figures and elected officials coming to the event. And that was particularly interesting, and there was a big political discourse very recently when President Trump went to Louisiana. And if you watch the blogs and if you watch the media, there's quite a lot of coverage on, making an event or an emergency a big platform for politicking and big platform for public appearances where the responders and decision-making teams are busy with the priorities of saving lives and containing the incident. And what they need coordination, but they really don't need disruptors or distractors. And there is, in emergency management, there is this ongoing discussion. Is it good for the public official to come to the scene of an event, to come to the incident command post, to come to to the EOC, or is it better for them to support it differently? And there are different schools of thought on that, but definitely with a presidential visit, there are a lot of issues such as security and extra protection and extra credentialing, and really detracting a big focus on that political appearance from your tasks and tactical operations. So obviously having some sort of virtual platform to where you can have those, maybe not president, that, this is an extreme case, but having your representatives. We had Kevin Brady came into our emergency operations center during Ike. And obviously that was a big disruption because, suddenly there is a high profile visit and you have to make sure that, you've got coffee and you've got food and you've got somebody that looks good that can talk to the representative, or somebody that, can do a good briefing and that introduces stress. But at the same time, you need those political figures at your event because they can give you support and they can give you voice, and they can highlight certain issues. So obviously, when you look at the presidential visit going to Louisiana, that brought a lot of attention to the event itself. So, it's sort of double-edged sword. But again, virtual EOC or virtual command post, or the ability to set up some sort of platform for those elected officials to be part of that, but not be a big disruption force, is definitely critical. So I thought that you had a really good and interesting conversation on that. Nick was selected the computer-aided dispatch, and you had a nice discussion on that, what you can do in your response operations, law enforcement, how you can track your patrol vehicles and where they are dispatched, and, how fast they are moving and where they are going, and so on, from just your from through that computer-aided dispatch, and you had some discussion on those multi-agency coordination centers where they bring all kinds of different entities, and they bring those share information networks and integrated communications. And one of them was the one CTCC, and with multiple, it's sort of fusion of all those communicative processes and information sharing into one particular physical entity, or physical entity supported with some virtual entities. And as compared to Transtar, I think you did a good research on Transtar. I think Nick looked at what Transtar was about, and it started as the Harris County Metro and Department of Transportation, and then eventually it has grown to have and house in its facility not only Metro, which is the transport in that fourth largest city in the nation. In any critical incident is going to be pivotal, especially with all the camera systems, 300 plus camera systems for all the roads and traffic regulation. But it also now houses the Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, so which is on the third floor. So you've got that entity, which is co-located with Metro, and it's co-located with some units from Texas Department of Transportation. So you've got state, and you've got the city, and then you've got also the county. So it's a really nicely integrated, they're all separate on the different floors, but they are at that physical location. If you, for example, need to have a joint information system, you need to set up the joint information center. It is definitely much easier, when you have that physical proximity, or you have, it's much easier also to streamline your information sharing and do interoperable communications. I think that you had some discussion also on social media trackers, City of Dallas UC, I think it was Ryan, that talked about plugging into looking at different social media platforms and leveraging that for emergency management. And I'm not sure if I mentioned that to you before, but I was in the Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management for the Super Bowl. And I was in a joint information center, and my job was, and it was activated, for that event, just as the event monitoring and event tracking. Of course, the incident command post was not there, but the joint information system was located at TransStar. And what we did is we scanned social media and particularly looked at certain hashtags. So depending on the day, many different events like Club Nomadic that opened. There's this big venue for concerts. Taylor Swift, I think, played. And so they were monitoring anything that the public was putting out as far as parking, as far as crowds, as far as mood of the public, because if you recall, the Super Bowl happened right after the president's ban on the countries that were considered not adequately prepared to vet the refugees. And so there's, if you recall, and that caused quite a lot of social stir. And there were high concerns that there's going to be civil unrest. So we monitored social media to see if there were any groups of protesters forming and geographically where they were forming. So of all the hashtags for no to the ban, we were pulling out the ones that had to specifically do with Super Bowl. So, and we're looking whether, there were any signs of that. And, some interesting protester groups emerged as well. At the same time, we're able to track the tweets by the Metro, because even though we were in the same building, we still, were scanning the Twitter and looking at the feeds, and so getting a real up to the second nearly information, and then pushing it out to all the partners that were on those Twitter accounts connected, and so they could push that information out. So very, very interesting analytical function, good building of the situational awareness. There was a bicycle incident where the biker was hit by the Metro. That was, we knew about it in seconds because it was, we watched those tweets on Twitter. And then we were pushing that out, and then pushing it out and making sure, also monitoring the media, that what the media were reporting was consistent with what the situation was in the Joint Information Center. So those are some of the examples what TransStar does, and TransStar will activate its Joint Information Center for any planned big event like that. And in the Super Bowl as well, there was the Vice President visit. So we knew that the Vice President was coming. And so we were watching, the social media around the vice presidential visit as well, making sure that we followed the Coast Guard, that we followed, the partners, the FBI, the city, and what they were reporting, what they were putting out, about flight restrictions and things like that. So definitely, we have made a huge progress in leveraging, those type of ways of supplying the information or creating a common operating picture and disseminating it very fast, because it's all about timely dissemination. Somebody actually sits there and monitors. And that's the issue that I have seen with WebEOC. Those situational updates sort of scroll and things get inputted, but if there's nobody watching it and analyzing it, then you're not going to know that some hospital needs diesel fuel. So even though you have a vendor that's got 5,000 gallons of diesel fuel here in that jurisdiction, if you don't scroll that, 3 screens before somebody requested diesel fuel for a hospital, this is just a static display board. So, the whole issue is of making it functional. I think that Ryan talked about Dallas County trying to get their hands on some social media chat tracker, that tracks, they've been investigative services for like Dallas PD have been using TweetDeck for investigative purposes for a while now, for at least 5 or 7 years. So those systems are popping up. I know personally about the software that we were considering to use for our classes with the online program. It was called Rodium, and was incident command system. That it was the internet-based resource allocation type of software that could integrate ICS forms and also virtual simulations about during an event, a population of resources, and a little bit like what Nick talked about with the GPS and MDTs and stuff like that, but that more specifically for incident command, to where you have NIMS type of forms integrated into it, Google Maps, things like that. So for a jurisdiction that's got like 50 or 100 or 150 users, those type of products like Rodium could be very useful. You talked about, I think, a lot about military use of different military technologies. Blue Force Tracker, I think it came up in your blogs as well. And a very interesting discussion you had, I thought Nick brought it up, was all technology is great, but you have to have redundancies. And redundancy is this big concept in building resilience and in having robustness of the systems. And a big part of a continuity of operation planning too, because ultimately the technology can fail. And then if you do not know how to use a map, that's a problem. And, particularly with, millennial generation or, professionals entering the workforce that have very minimal work experience, they might not know how to use the ham radio, for example. And I think ham radio operators are critical in emergency management. And a lot of times we forget about very simple solutions. And I think that's the point that Nick was making, that the resiliency lies in redundancy. We install the best, we hope we are trained and we practice with the best and state-of-the-art technology, and we hope that we work with the technology in exercises, because you're not going to work out all those kinks with Skype and TweetDecks and all those things in the real event. You have to practice with it to know how different agencies can use it jointly, but at some point your junky analog radios can become really, really critical. And do you know how to use those as well? Because those simple solutions, typically they're simple. So, we used to call them they're Russian, they're built out of 3 components, and, they are not going to be prone to certain issues that, those very complex systems have. They're tightly coupled, and one problem cascades into another problem, and you can have a total system failure of a very, very sophisticated program. And then you need to rely on something very simple, like runners, or pigeons. So that was the a very very interesting conversation that you had. You brought up something about the Israeli ways of using cell phones and some of the concerns with cell phone use. I think you spent quite a bit of time talking about the use of cell phones in military operations and how traditionally they're not allowed, and they would make life so much easier because everybody uses them every day. And you talked about concerns with IEDs and triggering and setting off explosives. And so in a less conventional warfare and insurgency, there might be some concerns about some of those technologies, because as much as you can leverage them, they can also be a foe in the other way. And I think your discussion was that, the cell phones or some of those systems were the last resorts or the last go-to. And even, I believe, Ryan or Nick, you mentioned, maybe Matthew, you all have that military experience. You talked about how those systems would be blocked to where you cannot actually turn those off. So block a wide frequency range. I think that's some of the notes that I had. So overall, the emergency operation centers and emergency management leveraging technology has to come, and Ryan always gets back to training and exercises and practicing and physical emergency operation centers are obviously preferred, but the virtual ones during floods, when the big areas are affected, such as the hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, where swaths of lands are affected, there might be a useful way to remedy those. So I hope you got to access the Pacific Disaster Center and look at some resiliency indices and another way of using technologies for this is more for the situational awareness globally, to track certain events and use those for analysis, looking at the factors and indicators and collecting data across the board that can also increase the situational awareness and the decision making. So I think that's all I had as far as my notes. So, a lot of conversation on leadership, whether centralized or decentralized, on redundancy of systems, using backups, relying on traditional methods while opening your mind, and like you had that discussion on the military, to some of the technologies that are off the shelf, that are widely used by a general population, and some of the pitfalls with using those, because everybody uses those. So naturally they can be used to your disadvantage as well. So I wanted to thank you for the conversation. I didn't hear a lot of discussion about the Sahana and how that was used in particularly for people tracking and reunification of families in a major global disasters. How do you use communication systems? And there's quite a bit of research emerging on leveraging social networks and communities. Now you can have the most remote parts of the world, like in India after the Nepal earthquake, where people don't have much. They might not have homes, they might not have cars, they might not have transportation, but they have cellular devices, and they have access to internet, and it's more widespread. how do you use drones in disaster relief? That was a really big thing in Nepal. So it's another use of technology, not just for your traditional, for example, surveillance, but also delivery of food in remote areas and things like that. So not just our communications, technology for communications, but thinking about endorsing technology and using creative ways for disaster relief as well. So thank you for your Hangout. I'm looking forward to your last one, which I'm about to watch today, and I hope you you had a small group, but I do hope that you enjoyed the Google Hangouts overall, that you're working on your continuity of operation planning. And Matthew, thank you for your blog on global traveling awareness. I found it very interesting. I reminds me of some of the things that I've noticed when I travel, such as and I don't think that you had a discussion on that, but alternating your schedules, not sitting in one restaurant for too long of a time, not having your favorite restaurant when you travel. Don't go always to the same place. Take different routes. Know where you park. Don't open the right side car door. When you have a remote and dark areas and things like that. I actually had a situation last year when I was traveling in Europe, and that was a security issue. So traveling abroad and making those plans is really critical, particularly for private businesses that have operations in other countries where emergency management might not be as developed or as robust, or there is no public administration to handle some of those things the way we do. So it's very, the emergency management during traveling, or for travelers, or for, corporate people that go and visit their businesses, is becoming really important as well in the hotel business, and, in owning real estate in other countries. So good talk. Good luck with the last week, and I'll see you on the feedback on the last Hangout.